I'm going to talk about something a little bit different. I'm going to talk about some ways that possibly ArchivesSpace could be made more relevant to maybe some of you or people that, users that you serve or people that you know may be possibly interested in using ArchivesSpace or something like it in the future. I'm going to talk about some things related to standard support and also language support within ArchivesSpace and potential directions that things like that could go. So here's specifically what I'll be talking about. So first I'm going to give a little explanation of what I mean when I say crosswalking. Then specifically looking at standard support and crosswalking for ArchivesSpace. So what standards ArchivesSpace is based upon, thinking specifically about descriptive metadata standards, really. Looking at some, not in detail, but talking about some possible crosswalks that might be especially relevant for ArchivesSpace and people that might be interested in using ArchivesSpace, and talking about some ways that those of you or others can get involved in crosswalking ArchivesSpace to different descriptive metadata standards. I'm also going to talk about language support for ArchivesSpace and sort of what languages ArchivesSpace currently supports, as well as how you or others can get involved in providing translations for ArchivesSpace, and potentially other things that you might be interested in the language realm. Ideally, and I know like we're a small group, so it doesn't necessarily always feel comfortable, but if you're interested, it would be great to also have a discussion of that and what you really feel like you need or how you think it would be best for ArchivesSpace to grow when it comes to standards or language support. So I'm going to put these up here as just discussion questions for later. Some things to think about during my presentation, and we'll revisit these at the end. Feel free to chat at any point during this presentation, and also, feel free to unmute and interrupt me during the presentation too. I have no problem with that. But also be thinking about these discussion questions, and if any of them, if thoughts come to you related to any of these. So crosswalking, what do I mean when I say crosswalking? So in what I'm talking about here related to metadata, I'm talking about the process of determining equivalences or equivalent elements between two or more schema. So in this case, really, we're thinking of ArchivesSpace as the things that it records as being a schema, and then a particular metadata standard or other system. It could be a different archival information management system that you use. It could be a proprietary product like that. It could be a completely homegrown thing that you've done. It could be the spreadsheets that you have that you've recorded information in before. How do those things map to ArchivesSpace? And in this discussion, I'm really thinking like particularly for if you're using specific metadata standards for that, but it can also be relevant for a migration project that involves your local systems. When you're doing crosswalking, not every element is going to have an exact match, but often you can come close enough to be acceptable. So, we're all used to making compromises on different things. So often when you're crosswalking between two different standards, you can find like, it's not quite what it means in these two different things. They're not quite the same, but they're close enough to be acceptable. That crosswalking process, though, may also identify elements that have no acceptable match. So then you really need to think about, okay, if this compromise isn't acceptable, if there isn't an acceptable compromise, then what needs to be done? In the case of this, with the ArchivesSpace community, it could be helpful to have a community discussion to determine if there are modifications needed to ArchivesSpace to make ArchivesSpace actually support that standard. And is there support within the community for making them? And then I'm kind of shoehorning this in there, but it's a related topic. So it's not crosswalking per se, but I also would like to talk about how we can facilitate supporting more languages within ArchivesSpace. So standards first. The big types of standards that I'm thinking about in this standards discussion are data content standards and data structure standards. So data content standards, they specify, sort of what data points you're capturing and where are you getting that information. So what is the syntax for getting that information? Data structure standards are really like what format they need to be in to get a specific output. So the data content standard that ArchivesSpace is based on, and really where it all starts, is describing Archives of Content Standard, DAX. That's really how, how it was determined, the broad sense of, this is what would be in a resource record. This is the kind of information we should capture in an accession record. These are the points that are important to know when you're describing archivable materials. On the data structure side, we support a number of different imports and exports. They're dependent on the record type, and some of them are a little bit dependent we made choices with all of these. Generally, we don't support the entire schema for Mark XML, say. It's not every single possible element you could have there. It's a subset of that was considered particularly relevant for what people would need to do in ArchivesSpace. But in terms of data structure standards, we support EAD, definitely EAD 2002 most completely, and then there's some support for EAD 3. We also support Marks XML for certain kinds of records, EAC CPF for agent records, Dublin Core, MODS, and METS for digital object records. And while data content and data structure standards are really what I'm talking about here, there are, of course, other kinds of standards that the kinds of description that happens in ArchivesSpace are informed by, and ArchivesSpace is informed by. So things like premise for write statements, information, and preservation metadata. For our digital objects module, ArchivesSpace is not a digital repository, but it certainly is intended to interact with people's digital repositories. So our digital objects module is informed by OAIS, or Open Archival Information System standard. And then things like some of our controlled value lists within ArchivesSpace, the values for them are pulled from a specific standard. Like for our language list, that comes from ISO 639-2. So then when you get to thinking about what are we really thinking would be particularly relevant standards to crosswalk ArchivesSpace 2? I think probably the clearest and most obvious are ISAT-G and ISAR-CPF, things that are used in the archival community in many, many parts of the world and many archival repositories. And they have pretty close connection to the data content standard in the case of ISAT-G, or EAC-CPF in the case of ISAR-CPF, to things that ArchivesSpace is already built on. So crosswalking is probably a pretty simple, as simple as metadata can get, exercise compared to some other things that have a weaker connection. So something like cataloging cultural objects from the museum community, or CCO, or VRA core from the visual materials community, that specific data structure standard from the visual materials community. It's not that those things can't be done, they just don't have as close a connection. So it might take a little bit more work in the application itself beyond just finding good compromises or good equivalences with things like ISAT-G and ISAR-CPF. For things like CCO and VRA core, there may be elements that are particularly necessary for those two that don't currently have a home in ArchivesSpace. So it might require more work in ArchivesSpace than things like ISAT-G and ISAR-CPF. We have seen at least one example of a community project where a community that really wanted to be able to capture information in ArchivesSpace to be able to support a particular standard um, wasn't already there in the application, so they worked on creating a specification and then developing a plugin to do that. So that came from, that was a project involving PV Core, a standard for capturing information about audiovisual materials. And that work was done by WGBH Public Television and some of their partners here in the United States. And that was done through the very cutely named PV Space plugin. So there's these different examples to go from, looking for a particularly strong connection between a standard that ArchivesSpace is already based on and another standard that others are using. Maybe thinking about like looking something that has a weaker connection to ArchivesSpace but that people are really interested in thinking about how ArchivesSpace could be extended for it, or a completely community-based project that that in this case had people that were using ArchivesSpace already, needed to make it work for them, but were able to do that without substantial work in the application, but by doing it through a plugin. So what we've done is we have created a crosswalking spreadsheet to start out with some of those more closely connected standards that people use in the wider archival community. I'll show you what that spreadsheet looks like in a minute. The link for it is there. And sort of thought of like how this work could be built out and built upon. But really what happens next with this is going to depend on the level of interest in the wider archives community. So this could be something as simple as just a reference document for people who are thinking about how to take their existing information and that is described in some of these standards and move it over to ArchivesSpace. Or it could be something that's actually built into the application in some way, as maybe a different set of translations or a different view. Or in the case of data structure standards, it may be that are a new set of imports or exports that are needed to support that standard along with the crosswalk. But we really, because ArchivesSpace is a community-built application, before we would embark on any of those things, we would really want to see interest from the community in doing those. So this is what the crosswalking spreadsheet looks like. You see that it has 4 tabs currently, one for ISAT-G, one for ISAR-CPF, one for ISDIA, and one for RAD. The ISAT-G one is the most completely filled out. It has a column for the particular area or element in the standard, has an indication of whether that's a required area or element really, in the standard, and then looks at the fields in ArchivesSpace and tries to find a good match for that. In the case of ISAT-G, we also get a little further into it in thinking about the different record types. So the things that Jessica showed you, if there's a difference in how ISAT-G maps to ArchivesSpace between an accession record or a resource record or a digital object record. This spreadsheet is open for people to make contributions to it. So if you're interested in this kind of work, we definitely encourage you to comment on what's there. There's a lot of additional work that could be done there. Even something as simple as saying, yes, this looks like a good match. Or something as simple as saying, no, this is not a good match. Here's what would be a better match. Or if you are interested in things that aren't represented in the spreadsheet at all, if there are standards that you're interested in that are not represented on the spreadsheet, you could add an entirely new crosswalk. This is a thing where we would expect that it wouldn't necessarily need to be, and it certainly wouldn't probably be best for it to be, one person who does all the work on this. We would see this as being optimally a group effort. So that also leads into saying that we encourage you to get discussions going about standards in the ArchivesSpace community or about communities in which you're involved to gauge, like, is there an interest in this for ArchivesSpace specifically? Are there better ways to do this than with ArchivesSpace? So that's the standards opening here. Then I wanted to talk a little bit about language support. So starting sort of similarly with what ArchivesSpace has now. ArchivesSpace is built in English, and specifically in American English. You will see, you might occasionally, if you're looking at the code or you've encountered an error warning that's kind of deep in there, you might see that there's some Australian or British English in there because the original developers of the application were from Australia. ArchivesSpace, though, even though it's built in a particular language, it supports localization, which means that you're able to translate the interface labels and the tooltips. What Jessica showed you, sort of the way you can hover over a label and get an explanation of what that field is. The tooltips can also be translated into different languages. They don't, and localization, I should say, also doesn't mean just different languages. It can also just be the customization that you do to make these things a little bit more relevant for your own institution and your own implementation. You can maintain those translations locally, or you can contribute them to the core code of ArchivesSpace so that others can benefit. And we have had some translations submitted by community members that now come with a release of ArchivesSpace. So we have 3 of those, French, Japanese, and Spanish. And as ArchivesSpace continues to grow in places where English is not the dominant language, or where people have users for whom English is not the dominant language, there are certainly opportunities for more. So there are ways that you can get involved in contributing translations now. The process for it right now is a little bit clunky, especially if you don't know how to work in GitHub. But the current method is that you can edit YAML files in the code. YAML file it looks a lot like a text file, and it contains the information on what the labels and the tooltip should be. So if you were going to do that, you would clone the GitHub repository and work with the 5 files that are listed there. Those are the 5 files that contain all the information on what the labels should say and what the tooltip should say. Each label or tooltip within the ArchivesSpace interfaces has a value translation pair in the appropriate file. So for example, if you wanted to change the welcome message in the public user interface that says, I think I actually changed this. So it's not the one that says find what you're looking for, the one that says search across our collections, digital materials, and more. You would look in the public/config/locale/en.yml file. So you could go from this text on the public user interface to the directory on GitHub, pick out either, whichever of these languages you wanted, or if you wanted to add a brand new one, you could add a brand new one. you would look for the specific line in there, the specific value translation pair. So in this case, in the English file, the value is called welcome message, and the translation is search across our collections, digital materials, and more. And then if you wanted to change it into French, you would go to the French file and look for the welcome message there and change this text there. And again, if you wanted to add a different language, you would just add a whole new file. You could change as much or as little of that file as you wanted. The default would still be the English things that were there in the first place, but you could change individual translations there. You could change the whole thing. And then you would need to get it back into the core code. So, or onto your local release. So some tips for doing translations this way. Not all of the files are in an ArchivesSpace release file. So you do have to start from the source code itself. When you get an ArchivesSpace release, it does have a couple YAML files in it, but they only have a limited set of the labels and tooltips. So if you wanted to change everything, you would need to do that in the release file. I mean, you would need to do that in the source code itself. So that means you're going to have to make your own release or use the dev servers to see your changes. And unless you're comfortable working within GitHub, it's going to be until that point that you need to actually push it back up, it's going to be best for you to use a text editor or an XML editor when you're editing them. You're only going to want to change the translations in the value translation pair, the part that's after the colon, not the values. So over here where you see welcome message, you're not going to want to change where it says welcome _ message colon, because that's information that is needed always for in any language. You're going to only want to change the part after here. You also need to maintain the spacing and the tabbing from the original file. So don't change the way things are indented here. If you change the way the things are indented there, they won't be understood anymore. And then lastly, definitely if you're doing all this work, consider submitting a pull request back to the GitHub repository to make your translations available to the wider ArchivesSpace community. Because in addition to helping others, that's also going to make it a lot easier for you to maintain. You're not going to have to go through that process every single time you want to update one of your language files. You're going to get the benefit of them being in there and the benefit of other people working to maintain them as well. So that's the hard way. That's the current way, and that's the hard way to do it. But we have an easier way coming. And we're using a service called Weblate, and there's a URL there for the project that we've set up there for the interfaces of ArchivesSpace, using those 5 files that I mentioned. And using that service, you'll be able to add to or edit the existing language files. You'll be able to add completely new languages, so things beyond just the Spanish, French, and Japanese that we already have. If you wanted to add a whole new language, you could do that. You can also, it's not on you to add everything for that language. You can add just a few words, or entire sections of the interface, and you don't have to sit there and do it all at the same time. You can do it in one sitting or over time. So this is definitely like kind of what we try to do with ArchivesSpace overall, whether it's user support or whether it's doing development for the application, whether it's having an event like this. We try to really work with the power of the community. So working in this service, we'll be able to identify needs for these different translations. We'll be able to, each other will be able to share work and provide continuous improvement for that language support. If this sounds great and you're already really excited about it, feel free to contact us if you're ready to get involved, and we can get you started on that. We haven't done a launch of Weblate yet, but we're hoping to do that soon. But if you already know that you want to participate and you're getting the sneak peek here tonight, then let us know. We'll be happy to get you involved. So here's a little bit of what this looks like. So versus like seeing a directory on GitHub with files that stand alone, you can see here for those same public interface translations, you can see, all right, here are the 4 sets of translations. Here are my 4 options for what languages are already there. And also there's a start a new translation button here if you want to start it up in a completely new language. And then same with as what I showed you before, where it was in a text file. Now there's a GUI interface here, or there's an interface here where you can enter into a web form, like taking the words that are here and putting what their equivalent translation would be in a different language. There's also an opportunity to, maybe you're not all that sure of, what you put in there. You'd like to sort of get a consult on whether something else might be better. There's ways to call things out for whether, you feel how confident you feel in it, and whether it's merely a suggestion or whether it's truly something that you think, yes, this is definitely what it should be. So if you're interested in getting involved in providing more language support for ArchivesSpace, there's a few things that you can do. So right now, you could contribute full set of translation files to the core code of ArchivesSpace via GitHub. If you're interested already, or if you want to wait for the launch of Weblate, you can participate in our crowdsourcing project to add more to a current translation that's there, or add a new set of translations. And I should say, like, this is a never-ending project because we're always developing the application, building it out in new ways, and making changes and adding new things to ArchivesSpace means new labels are coming in or labels are changing. So a lot of times even an existing translation that was complete at the time that it was done needs more things later on because more things have been added to the application. And then lastly, just as with standard support, we encourage you to get a discussion going on about language support in the ArchivesSpace community or in other communities in which you're involved. So it's later. Now it's later. It's time to think about these discussion questions. Please, if you're interested, please participate in the chat or unmute. So these are the 3 that I had for you at the beginning of the presentation. Do standards or language support present barriers to your use of ArchivesSpace? What specific needs do you have around standards or language support? And how have you seen standards or language challenges addressed in other communities in which you're involved? So does anyone have a take on the first one? Are there any barriers that you felt like you've experienced in thinking about using ArchivesSpace related to either standards or language support? Have you made any compromises for things that you felt like you needed for standards or language support in coming over to ArchivesSpace? Has anyone used ISAT-G with other systems that you used or were considering using prior to coming to ArchivesSpace? Is it something that you're still thinking about? How about languages? Is anyone using non-English languages? Does anyone use the either for their own local version or sort of in your communities? Would you typically yourself or with users prefer to use other languages? So Saskia, we have a lot of EADs we want to upload in ArchivesSpace once we have implemented it. Half of them are in Dutch and half of them are in English. What are the experiences with these mixed languages? E.g., all your labels must be in one language. Currently, that is definitely the case in ArchivesSpace. But we certainly have heard from people that have reasons that, and in fact, also Dutch, that have a need to be able to present information in Dutch and English. So in your case, Saskia, it's not even being able to support one language versus another language. It's to be able to do both. Laura, on the standard side, we've had discussions on this and found that a few tweaks like renaming fields and compromises we can make, you can make ArchivesSpace ISAG compliant and fit our needs. You're currently working on this. University of Sheffield. Laura, is there any specific tweak you can think of? Not to test you, but just in case. Are there any of those tweaks that you can mention? And Yayashri, you say, oh, 4 different languages that you have. Material in 4 different Indian languages apart from English. How do we cross-refer this material? As we haven't really started using ArchivesSpace, we don't have specific questions yet. So I kind of, in the presentation, was talking more about the labeling and tooltips in ArchivesSpace, but this is another thing that we definitely do hear about, is being able to do parallel description. And this also fits the Dutch use case too. Being able to do parallel description for materials, and in your, I think, in some cases, do people have the same collections, have multiple languages in them, that you need to be able to present like a title in 4 different languages, say? Or is it more there's one language per collection? It's just that sometimes you need to be able to do description in one language versus a different language. Oh, University of Sheffield again, odd item in Cyrillic, but you haven't tried to upload the records yet. And East Asian languages too. In ArchivesSpace, you definitely can, if it's a single language that you need to be able to describe materials in, the language itself, the language of description itself, you certainly can record in ArchivesSpace. But if you needed to record parallel descriptions for the same material, or if you needed to be able to present sort of the labeling for it, to researchers or to yourselves in different languages based on either, you know, what language of description was being used, or based on, say, user choice. That is limited functionality in ArchivesSpace right now. Or not meaning to test you. But so Laura, you said like you found that compromise with renaming the fields so that it was in standard language you recognize, helped you with the ISAG. And Jayashri, you say multiple items in one collection has 3 languages. You definitely, the recording the language itself, recording the description itself, as I said, would definitely be possible. But if you needed to be able to do the labeling, or if you needed to be able to do, you know, multiple titles or notes in multiple different languages for the same thing, that currently is not possible. But it's something that we've heard more and more from people, that it's something that they'd really like to be able to do. And Laura, you say a lot of the fields, it seems, have DAX functionality that can still be used for ISAG. Has anyone here done any customization for their tooltips? And our tooltips do mention DAX, like there's usually a DAX citation in the tooltips. So if somebody's, you know, if DAX isn't as familiar to them, that might be a very obvious thing that they might want to take out. But I'm curious if anyone has done any customization on their tooltips to make them more relevant in terms of things like that. Laura says, yeah, you think further down the line you will customize the tooltips. So in terms of things that you need, that people feel like they need here, and certainly correct me if I'm wrong, or put more things in the chat if you can think of more things. It doesn't sound like, at least of the group here, that there's all that much need for additional metadata standard support. It sounds like that by itself doesn't sound like a real need right now, at least among this group. But it does sound like sort of additional language support, including being able to do parallel description of certain things, certain collection materials, may be helpful. And also being able to present multiple languages in the interface. I don't know, the Dutch folks, I don't know if you, because we don't currently have a Dutch translation in ArchivesSpace. I know that somebody was working on it. I don't know if that's something you've thought of down the line, of if that's going to be something you're going to want to pursue, is being able to have your labels in Dutch for certain circumstances.